At dawn, the air was clear and still. As soon as the sun came up, the swans flew off with Elissa, and they left the rock behind. The waves still tossed, and from the height where they soared, it looked as if the white flecks of foam against the dark green waves were millions of white swans swimming upon the waters. When the sun rose higher, Elissa saw before her a mountainous land half floating in the air. Its peaks were capped with sparkling ice, and in the middle rose a castle that was a mile long, with a bold colonnade perched upon another. Down below, palm trees swayed and brilliant flowers bloomed as big as mill wheels. She asked if this was the land for which they were bound, but the swans shook their heads. What she saw was the gorgeous and ever-changing palace of Fata Morgana. No mortal being could venture to enter it. As Elissa stared at it, before her eyes the mountains, palms, and palace faded away, and in their place rose 20 splendid churches, all alike, with lofty towers and pointed windows. She thought she heard the organ peal, but it was the roll of the ocean she heard. When she came close to the churches, they turned into a fleet of ships sailing beneath her. But when she looked down, it was only a sea mist drifting over the water. Scene after scene shifted before her eyes until she saw at last the real country whither they went. Mountains rose before her beautifully blue, wooded with cedars and studded with cities and palaces. Long before sunset, she was sitting on a mountainside in front of a large cave, carpeted over with green creepers so delicate that they looked like embroidery. "We shall see what you'll dream of here tonight," her youngest brother said, as he showed her where she was to sleep. "I only wish I could dream how to set you free," she said. This thought so completely absorbed her, and she prayed so earnestly for the Lord to help her that even in her sleep she kept on praying. It seemed to her that she was flying aloft to the Fata Morgana palace of clouds. The fairy who came out to meet her was fair and shining, yet she closely resembled the old woman who gave her the berries in the forest, and told her of the swans who wore golden crowns on their heads. "Your brothers can be set free," she said. "But have you the courage and tenacity to do it? The sea water that changes the shape of rough stones is indeed softer than your delicate hands, but it cannot feel the pain that your fingers will feel. It has no heart, so it cannot suffer the anguish and heartache that you will have to endure. Do you see this stinging nettle in my hand? Many such nettles grow around the cave where you sleep. Only those, and the ones that grow upon graves in the churchyards, may be used. Remember that. Those you must gather, although they will burn your hands to blisters. Crush the nettles with your feet, and you will have flax, which you must spin and weave into 11 shirts of mail with long sleeves. Once you throw these over the 11 wild swans, the spell over them is broken. But keep this well in mind. From the moment you undertake this task until it is done, even though it lasts for years, you must not speak. The first word you say will strike your brothers' hearts like a deadly knife. Their lives are at the mercy of your tongue. Now remember what I told you." She touched Elissa's hand with nettles that burned like fire and awakened her. It was broad daylight, and close at hand where she had been sleeping grew a nettle like those of which she had dreamed. She thanked God upon her knees and left the cave to begin her task. With her soft hands, she took hold of the dreadful nettles that seared like fire. Great blisters rose on her hands and arms, but she endured it gladly in the hope that she could free her beloved brothers. She crushed each nettle with her bare feet and spun the green flax. When her brothers returned at sunset, it alarmed them that she did not speak. They feared this was some new spell cast by their wicked stepmother. But when they saw her hands, they understood that she labored to save them. The youngest one wept, and wherever his tears touched Elissa, she felt no more pain, and the burning blisters healed. She toiled through the night, for she could not rest until she delivered her beloved brothers from the enchantment. Throughout the next day, while the swans were gone, she sat all alone, but never had the time sped so quickly. One shirt was made, and she set to work on the second one. Then she heard the blast of a hunting horn on the mountainside. It frightened her, for the sound came nearer until she could hear the hounds bark. Terror-stricken, she ran into the cave, bundled together the nettles she had gathered and woven, and sat down on this bundle. Immediately a big dog came bounding from the thicket, followed by another, and still another, all barking loudly as they ran to and fro. In a few minutes, all the huntsmen stood in front of the cave. The most handsome of these was the king of the land, and he came up to Elisa. Never before had he seen a girl so beautiful. "My lovely child," he said, "how do you come to be here?" Elisa shook her head, for she did not dare to speak. Her brother's deliverance and their very lives depended on it, and she hid her hands under her apron to keep the king from seeing how much she suffered. "Come with me," he told her. "You cannot stay here. If you are as good as you are fair, I shall clothe you in silk and velvet, set a golden crown upon your head, and give you my finest palace to live in." Then he lifted her up on the horse. When she wept and wrung her hands, the king told her, "My only wish is to make you happy. Some day you will thank me for doing this." Off through the mountains he spurred, holding her before him on his horse as his huntsmen galloped behind him. At sundown, his splendid city with all its towers and domes lay before them. The king led her into this palace where great fountains played in the high marble halls, and where both walls and ceilings were adorned with paintings. But she took no notice of any of these things. She could only weep and grieve. Indifferently, she let the women dress her in royal garments, weave strings of pearls in her hair, and draw soft gloves over her blistered fingers. She was so dazzlingly beautiful in all this splendor that the whole court bowed even deeper than before, and the king chose her for his bride, although the archbishop shook his head and whispered that his lovely maid of the woods must be a witch who had blinded their eyes and stolen the king's heart. But the king would not listen to him. He commanded the music be played, the costliest dishes be served, and the prettiest girls dance for her. She was shown through sweet-scented gardens and into magnificent halls, but nothing could make her lips smile or her eyes sparkle. Sorrow had its seal upon them. At length the king opened the door to a little chamber adjoining her bedroom. It was covered with splendid green embroideries and looked just like the cave in which he had found her. On the floor lay the bundle of flax she had spun from the nettles, and from the ceiling hung the shirt she had already finished. One of the huntsmen had brought these with him as curiosities. "Here you may dream that you are back in your old home," the king told her. "Here is the work that you were doing there, and surrounded by all your splendor, here it may amuse you to think of those times." When Elisa saw these things that were so precious to her, a smile trembled on her lips, and the blood rushed back to her cheeks. The hope that she could free her brothers returned to her, and she kissed the king's hand. He pressed her to his heart and commanded that all the church bells peal to announce their wedding. The beautiful mute girl from the forest was to be the country's queen. The archbishop whispered evil words in the king's ear, but they did not reach his heart. The wedding was to take place. The archbishop himself had to place the crown on her head. Out of spite, he forced the tight circlet so low on her forehead that it hurt her. But a heavier band encircled her heart, and the sorrow she felt for her brothers kept her from feeling any hurt of the flesh. Her lips were mute, for one single word would mean the death to her brothers, but her eyes shone with love for the kind and handsome king who did his best to please her. Every day she grew fonder and fonder of him in her heart. Oh, if only she could confide in him and tell him what grieved her, but mute she must remain, and finish her task in silence. So at night she would steal away from his side into her little chamber that resembled the cave, and there she wove one shirt after another. But when she set to work on the 7th, there was not enough flax left to finish it. She knew that the nettles she must use grew in the churchyard, but she had to gather them herself. How could she go there? Oh, what is the pain in my fingers compared with the anguish I feel in my heart? She thought, I must take the risk, and the good Lord will not desert me. As terrified as if she were doing some evil thing, she tiptoed down into the moonlit garden, through the long alleys, and down the deserted streets to the churchyard. There she saw a group of vampires sitting in a circle of one of the large gravestones. These hideous ghouls took off their ragged clothes as they were about to bathe. With skinny fingers, they clawed open the new graves. Greedily, they snatched out the bodies and ate the flesh from them. Elissa had to pass close to them and fix their vile eyes upon her, but she said a prayer, picked the stinging nettles, and carried them back to the palace. Only one man saw her, the Archbishop. He was awake while the others slept. Now he had proof of what he had suspected. There was something wrong with the queen. She was a witch, and that was how she had duped the king and all his people. In the confessional, he told the king what he had seen and what he had feared. As the bitter words spewed from his mouth, the images of the saints shook their heads as much as to say, "He lies. Elissa is innocent." The Archbishop, however, had a different explanation for this. He said they were testifying against her and shaking their heads at her wickedness. 2 big tears rolled down the king's cheeks as he went home with his suspicion in his heart. That night he pretended to be asleep, but no restful sleep touched his eyes. He watched Elissa get out of bed. Every night he watched her get up, and each time he followed her quietly and saw her disappear into her private little room. Day after day his frown deepened. Elissa saw it and could not understand why this should be, but it made her anxious and added to the grief her heart already felt for her brothers. Her hot tears fell down upon her queenly robes of purple velvet. There they flashed like diamonds, and all who saw the splendor wished that they were queen. Meanwhile, she had almost completed her task. Only one shirt was lacking, but again she ran out of flax. Not a single nettle was left. Once more, for the last time, she must go to the churchyard and pluck a few more handfuls. She thought with fear of the lonely walk and the ghastly vampires, but her will was as strong as her faith in God. She went upon her mission, but the king and his archbishop followed her. They saw her disappear through the iron gates of the churchyard, and when they came in after her, they saw vampires sitting on a gravestone, just as Elissa had seen them. The king turned away, for he thought Elissa was among them, Elissa whose head had rested against his heart that very evening. "Let the people judge her," he said, and the people did judge her. They condemned her to die by fire. She was led from her splendid royal halls to a dungeon dark and damp, where the wind whistled in between the window bars. Instead of silks and velvets, they gave her for a pillow the bundle of nettles she had gathered, and for her coverlet the harsh burning shirts of mail she had woven. But they could not have given her nothing that pleased her more. She set to work again and prayed. Outside, the boys in the streets sang, jeering songs about her, and not one soul came to comfort her with a kind word. But toward evening she heard the rustle of swans' wings close to her window. It was her youngest brother who had found her at last. She sobbed for joy, though she knew that this night was all too apt to be her last. The task was almost done, and her brothers were near her. The archbishop came to stay with her during her last hours on earth, for this much he had promised the king, but she shook her head, and by her expression and gestures begged him to leave. This was the last night she had to finish her task, or it would all go for naught. All her pain, and her tears, and her sleepless nights. The archbishop went away, saying cruel things against her, but poor Elissa knew her own innocence, and she kept on with her task. The little mice ran about the floor and brought nettles to her feet, trying to help her all they could, and a thrush perched near the bars of her window to sing the whole night through as merrily as he could so that she would keep up her courage. It was still in the early dawn, an hour before sunrise, when the 11 brothers reached the palace gates and demanded to see the king. This, they were told, was impossible. It was still night. The king was asleep and could not be disturbed. They begged and threatened so loudly that the guard turned out, and even the king came running to find what the trouble was. But at that instant the sun rose and the 11 brothers vanished. 11 swans were seen flying over the palace. All the townsmen went flocking out through the town's gates, for they wanted to see the witch burned. A decrepit old horse pulled the cart in which Elissa sat. They had dressed her in a coarse sackcloth, and all her lovely long hair hung loose around her beautiful head. Her cheeks were deathly pale, and her lips moved in silent prayer as her fingers twisted the green flax. Even on her way to death, she did not stop her still unfinished work. 10 shirts lay at her feet, and she worked away on the 11th. See how the witch mumbles, the mob scoffed at her. That's no psalm book in her hands. No, there she sits nursing her filthy sorcery. Snatch it away from her and tear it to bits. The crowd of people closed in to destroy all her work, but before they could reach her, 11 white swans flew down and made a ring around the cart with their flapping wings. The mob drew back in terror. It is a sign from heaven she must be innocent, many people whispered, but no one dared say it aloud. As the executioner seized her arm, she made haste to throw the 11 shirts over the swans, who instantly became 11 handsome princes, but the youngest brother still had a swan's wing in place of one arm, where a sleeve was missing from his shirt. Elessa had not quite been able to finish it. Now, she cried, I may speak. I am innocent. All the people who saw what had happened bowed down to her as they would before a saint. But the strain, the anguish, and the suffering had been too much for her to bear, and she fell into her brother's arms as if all life had gone out of her. She is innocent indeed, said her eldest brother, and he told them all what had happened. And while he spoke, the scent of 1,000,000 roses filled the air. For every piece of wood they had piled up to burn her had taken root and grown branches. There stood a great high hedge covered with red and fragrant roses. At the very top, a single pure white flower shone like a star. The king plucked it and put it on Ellis's breast, and she awoke with peace and happiness in her heart. All the church bells began to ring of their own accord, and the air was filled with birds. Back to the palace went a bridal procession such as no king had ever enjoyed before.